The Premier League is round the corner, so let's talk about some important stuff, like fantasy football. Remember, 100 million for 15 players is pretty tough, so let's find some value out there. So, what are the striking options? Well, looking at last year, we did have one very obvious, very expensive suspect, but below him, a nice range of players with mid-tier pricing, more than 6 million cheaper than Haaland, who had a great season and should look to replicate that this time round. Side note, Dominic Solanke, for example, could be going to Tottenham. That's well mooted, so that could make him more or less interesting depending on your perspective. But who are the real value options? Well, there are a few young guns, 22, 23 years old, who are probably going to look to make a real jump this season after a first experience in the Premier League last year. And we can pinpoint number 1, Morgan Rogers at Aston Villa, number 2, João Pedro at Brighton, and number 3, Rodrigo Muniz at Fulham. Let's look at the midfield options, and if we look at last year, we'll see all the usual suspects from the big four. However, the biggest surprise was the performances of Cole Palmer, and the question mark is, can he replicate that, knowing that Chelsea's in a bit of flux as well? But if we're looking for some value, let's start with Chelsea, and in particular Christopher Nkunku, who at 6.5 million would be an absolute steal. Really versatile across the front line, scores buckets of goals, again, if he can stay fit. At the same price tag, you can't do too badly with Leon Bailey at Aston Villa, or Morgan Gibbs-White at Nottingham Forest on set-piece duty. But if you have that extra million, I recommend Anthony Gordon or Gerard Bowen, both bringing a high goal return at that price tag. So, let's talk about defensive options. And looking back to last year, no surprise, Arsenal and Everton defenders really dominate with their performances. Outside of them, some nice interesting names like Porro at Tottenham, Schär at Newcastle, Guardiola, of course, at Manchester City. But if we're really looking for value, and particularly around that 4.5 million mark, then there's 3 or 4 names that could play out. Number 1, Mykolenko. If we're talking about Everton, he's probably the one that represents better value for money than his teammates. Number 2, Timothy Castagne at Fulham, someone who came from Leicester, played well, can play on either side, should look to push on once more. Number 3, someone who had a really solid Euros for Denmark, Joachim Andersen at Crystal Palace. And number 4, someone who had a bit less time at the Euros in performance but should have a big season with Aston Villa, Ezri Konsa. Please like and subscribe and let me know your choices.